Dreamscape presents Dazzle Ships, World War I and the Art of Confusion. Written by Barton. Illustrated by Victo Ngai. One of these ships is painted in sneaky, stripy camouflage. You probably can't even see it. Oh, you can see it? Note: England is the largest country in the United Kingdom, which is abbreviated UK, and is also informally known as Britain. The UK ran the British Empire, which included people and territories all over the world, and it was the UK's Royal Navy that made that empire possible. The British Empire was one of the major participants in World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, and was known at the time as the Great War. The British allied with, among others, Russia, France, Italy, Serbia, Romania, and, starting in 1917, the United States, to fight mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. That ship was an Allied vessel used during World War I, and it was camouflaged so strangely for a reason. More than 1,200 U.S. ships were decked out that way, and so were nearly twice as many ships in the British fleet. The idea was to make these ships harder for German torpedoes to sink. That's right, harder. What were we thinking? Well, as the old saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, was one of the largest wars the world had seen. Many nations were involved, including Germany on one side, and the United Kingdom, and eventually the United States on the other. German submarines, known as U-boats, were attacking and sinking ships in Britain's Royal Navy. The U stood for Unterseeboot, or undersea boat, food. As an island nation, Britain depended on goods arriving by sea. Too few boats were reaching Britain, and food was running out. The country might have to surrender so its people could eat. Submarines, and the torpedoes they fired, were big changes in the way wars were fought. Never before could an enemy hide beneath the waves and attack from a mile away. A U-boat crew would use its periscope to quickly peek above the surface of the water, pick a target, and launch a torpedo toward the spot where its target was going to be in a minute or so. Torpedoes were slower back then, but they were deadly. The sinking of ships, especially non-fighting ships, without any warning was new too. In the early years of the war, Germany limited which ships its U-boats attacked. But in early 1917 it saw a chance to win the war by starving Britain, its strongest opponent. Britain tried different things to stop the submarine attacks. There was talk of training seagulls and sea lions to spot the subs, and of having swimmers smash U-boats' periscopes with hammers. The British started having their supply ships stick close together and sail in convoys, guarded by armed vessels. The Royal Navy began using depth charges, 300-pound underwater weapons that would explode when they sank to certain levels to damage or destroy U-boats. And a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve Lieutenant Commander named Norman Wilkinson had another suggestion. It was unlikely. It was improbable. It may have even seemed bonkers. His idea was to camouflage the ships. Wilkinson's responsibilities included patrolling the waters off southwest England and sweeping for mines. He saw a lot of ships as part of his job. One Monday morning, after a weekend away spent fishing, he was headed back to work when inspiration struck. I suddenly got the idea that since it was impossible to paint the ship so that she could not be seen by a submarine, the extreme opposite was the answer. To paint her, not for low visibility, but in such a way as to break up her form, and thus confuse a submarine officer as to the course on which she was heading. The word camouflage itself was brand new at the time, but the concept of camouflage, of fooling an enemy into seeing something other than what's actually there, was an old one. And Wilkinson wasn't the first person ever to suggest camouflage for ships. Imaginative folks in the fields of art and science had tried before. Wilkinson, however, got his idea at just the right time. The British government was desperate to stop the U-boat attacks. It listened to Wilkinson's plan, named his approach Dazzle, and said, more or less, give it a try. So he did. In spring 1917, he had a ship Dazzle painted, with a crazy-looking pattern on one side and a crazy-looking pattern on the other side. These patterns were supposed to confuse German submarine crews about the ship's direction and speed. Dazzle was meant to make the Germans think a ship was, for example, turning toward the west, when it was actually headed to the southeast. U-boats didn't carry many torpedoes. If Dazzle could cause a German sub to waste a torpedo by firing it to a spot where a British ship wasn't actually going to be, and if this happened over and over, then more British ships would stay afloat and get their cargo to its destination. The Royal Navy liked Wilkinson's first ship, so it asked for 50 more done up in Dazzle, and it liked those next 50 so much that it asked him to paint every stuff-carrying ship that Britain had with those crazy combinations of black, white, gray, green, blue, purple, and pink. Of course, Wilkinson couldn't do all this on his own. 24 young women who had been to art schools did a lot of the work. They painted designs onto wooden models, and then they copied the best designs onto paper. Each approved Dazzle design got rushed off to ports all over England, where painters, laborers and artists alike, applied them to the sides of ships that were being unloaded and reloaded. How did Wilkinson know which designs to use? He had a test. One day the King of the United Kingdom dropped by to have a look. Now, King George V knew a lot about ships because he had joined the Royal Navy when he was just 12 years old. Wilkinson had the king look through a submarine periscope at a painted model on a rotating table. All the king had to do was figure out which direction the model ship was pointed in. It took him a while, more time than a sub-commander would have had, but finally the king had his answer. South by west, decided the king. Actually, Wilkinson replied, the model was pointing east-southeast. King George V had just been told that he was wrong. His Majesty walked over to the model for a closer look. Commander, he supposedly said to Wilkinson, I've been a professional sailor for many years, and I would not have believed I could have been so deceived in my estimate. In other words, the king himself had been dazzled. Members of the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps did the painting overnight, surprising those who had walked past a gray-colored building just the evening before. Britain, the United States, and their allies turned things around, and Germany surrendered in November 1918. By the time the fighting stopped, 1,256 American ships had been painted in Dazzle designs, along with more than 2,300 British ships. So just how well did Dazzle work? Nobody really knows. The U-boat attack stopped succeeding, but historians mostly give the credit to convoys and depth charges. Sorry, sea lions. While the United States said right after the war that Dazzle kept lots of ships from getting sunk, Britain wasn't so sure. The Royal Navy couldn't prove that Dazzle had actually spared any ships. But some insisted that, at the very least, the sailors on those ships just felt better, knowing that something had been tried to keep them from getting torpedoed. That sort of creativity is good for more than just morale. Times change. Technology changes. Torpedoes get faster. Submarine targeting systems get computerized. Challenges of all kinds get replaced by new ones. But a willingness to tackle problems by trying the unlikely, the improbable, the seemingly bonkers, will always be needed. After all, as those of us inspired by Norman Wilkinson's paint job know, sometimes desperate times call for dazzling measures. Author's note: Dazzle camouflage is a real-life example of information overload. When used on ships during World War I, those colors and patterns served as extra information that made it hard